We have petition 1088. I don't have the specific name here of the petitioner. I just have JR as initials from France. This is a dossier about FATCA, the US Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. This is to do with tax laws, with tax relationships between EU citizens and the US tax authorities. I presume the petitioner is here. Is he here? He, she, are they here? Excellent. Welcome. You have the floor, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Monsieur le Président. I'm going to use my 5 minutes just to maybe recap everybody in this room as to what's happened since I first presented my petition in July 2017, so almost 2 years ago, and then maybe share with you some of my thoughts on what is an extraordinarily complicated soap opera, I suppose is another way of describing this. So here we go. So what happened since July 2017 when I was last here? Professor Garbarino, at the request of Petty, commissioned a report into the compatibility of FATCA with European data norms, the GDPR in particular, and the findings were damning. There's multiple breaches of GDPR. What's interesting is obviously off the line, I've spoken to a lot of practitioners and academics across the European Union. I can't name them, but we're talking Queen's counsels in the UK who specialise in tax matters, and they tell me FATCA does not work with GDPR. It's as simple as that. The interesting points from Professor Garbarino's reports were, I think, and I really think that people need to focus on this, is that even if the US sticks to its practice of citizenship-based taxation and taxing non-resident citizens, most actually don't owe any US taxes. And so it almost begs the question as to why does the US have any interest in knowing about EU source income of US persons residing in the EU, as that income is just not going to generate any tax in the US. What the US wanted with FATCA, and I don't think it factored in CBT, it wants to know about US residents hiding money overseas. That's specifically what the UBS Swiss banking scandal was all about, and that's what brought FATCA to place. And I think that's a really important point in Garbarino's report that people just overlook all the time. Obviously, as everybody knows here, thanks to a lot of MEPs who are present here, and I can see a lot of friendly faces, thank you for your kind support. There was an absolutely overwhelming vote in favour of accidentals in the European Parliament, a kind of plebiscite of 470 votes in favour of our cause. And the resolution exhorted the European Commission and the Council of Ministers and European governments to do various things in favour of us, accidentals. I won't repeat those points because they're well known. So what's interesting to me is we've had lots of discussions with various people, the Commission and people in particular, and I can see lots of representatives of the Commission I'm now kind of quite familiar with, and there's this kind of hiding behind excuses, I would say, and there's nothing personal in this, but it's true, of we don't have enough data about what FATCA is doing inside the European Union. This is kind of anecdotal, but which I find fascinating is that I've done freedom of information requests in France because I'm a French citizen, I've done them in Ireland because I'm an Irish citizen, via my wife who's British, I've done them in the UK, to find out what the FATCA data flows really are. Astoundingly, all European governments refused our freedom of information requests, which beggars belief when one thinks about the purpose of FATCA, which is supposed to enhance transparency. So we're saying FATCA is here to enhance transparency, and yet governments won't tell us what data they're sharing with America under FATCA, I think primarily because they haven't got a clue, or if they do have a clue, they know that they're getting absolutely nothing from America and giving phenomenal amounts of data in return. And so what I did was, because we work very closely with other pockets of accidental Americans, I reached out to our cousins in Canada and Australia, and their governments are a bit more protective of their citizens, and just tried to generate some numbers by analogy. So here on the slide, you see, if I key off the 2016 Freedom of Information request that was launched in Australia, tiny little country compared to Europe, we're probably looking at about 18 million EU accounts that have been information has been shared with America, and probably amounts in the region of, I don't even know how to say this, 2,400 billion worth of euros of details of European citizens' financial information shared with America. So if that's not data for you, I don't know what is, but we can't do more than this. I think the other things that are interesting for me since the kind of 2012 is I've been in touch with all kinds of people. I know I pester a lot of you via email, and I apologize for that. But I've been pestering the Working Party Article 29, so now the European Data Privacy Board, fascinating to me, they don't even have an official position on the compatibility of FATCA with European data norms and the GDPR in particular. The European watchdog doesn't know, or probably rather doesn't want to have an official opinion on whether AEOI more generally is compatible with data norms. I find that astonishing. And this is, we followed up with our discussions with the Commission, and as I was alluding to earlier on, the Commission has always said to us, we want more data around the reality of FATCA. Is the Payment Accounts Directive being breached? Are accounts being closed? Are there breaches of GDPR? What's the value of information? Honestly, I think it's a bit of a kind of opt-out, and they're washing their hands a little bit. They know that we can't get that information. They know that our freedom of information requests are being blocked. And so there's really nothing that we can do. It's kind of willful blindness almost. I think just in terms of the quick updates before I kind of share more about my thoughts, I think the important point to note is that this is becoming a real issue. I mean, the first GDPR fine was handed out by the French CNIL to Google, and that was a 50 million euro fine. This is going to become a bit of an issue. If we do see, as everybody agrees, that GDPR and FATCA don't sit together, you're going to put European banks in an untenable position. And maybe the last point to finish on, because it's a nice segue with European banks, it's very important for people in this room to understand that the moratorium given by the US tax authorities to European banks to collect US social security numbers ends in December 2019. What is going to happen then? What are European banks going to do faced with people like myself, who are accidental Americans, who don't have social security numbers? They're going to be left with a kind of Sophie's choice of either taking their breaches of the Payment Account Directive to an entirely new level, breaching wholesale breaches of Payment Account Directive, or breaching FATCA and facing the punitive 30% withholding on US source income. So, yeah, I suppose the point I'm making here is that we as citizens have been petitioning you for years and nothing is really moving, but perhaps maybe now that people with deep pockets are will start to get in your faces, maybe you will start to protect us. It's a harsh message, but it's kind of the reality of the way European citizens feel right now. And so maybe just very quickly, I thought I would pass on to kind of what we feel is going on a little bit. I mean, these are just a kind of random assortment of thoughts, but to us as a community, it's astounding to see that the European Union pushes back on US overreach when it suits its agenda, its political agenda. We can see it on the Cloud Act, we can see it on JCPOA, we can see it on all the noises about the US being put on the EU tax haven blacklist. Kind of given the inaction of domestic politicians in Europe, lawsuits are starting to grow up all over the place, and you need to be aware of this. In Canada, it was a couple of weeks ago, the first hearing was held, and the Canadian government really struggled. In France, I can't talk too much about it, but we're acting very heavily. Israel, there have been lawsuits. There's a CRS lawsuit kicking off in the UK. And I suppose this is the point, which is if the inaction of the executive continues, then this matter will logically end up with the judiciary. And we already know from our discussions with academics and practitioners where they stand very clearly on the GDPR point. And that people probably want to think about that, because you bring FATCA down, you're threatening CRS. The US IRS, to me, is fascinating, is that they just can't work FATCA. It's evident from all the information coming from the States. They've started unwinding some of the most egregious and punitive withholdings under FATCA, which is a real sign that FATCA is just unworkable. There's another interesting thing that I thought, which is the next bullet point, which is even the Treasury Inspectorate General for Tax Administration report. They acknowledged that despite spending $380 million on FATCA, the IRS can't even use it. So you've got this instrument that's destroying the lives of innocent European accidental Americans, and it's not even fulfilling its purpose of kind of trying to catch the tax evaders. So I'm sorry, but something has to be done. This is also important. French, Dutch governments are announcing missions to Washington, D.C., and I even believe that Marc Le Fur and Saint-Martin are in Brussels today, and I think they're meeting with several MEPs. I mean, if there's an opportunity to chat to them, I'd love to. The Dutch government as well. Sophie will correct my Dutch when I say that Marco Sneet from the Tweede Kamer has personally said that he's so incensed with what's happening to Dutch accidentals that he's going to go to Washington himself to bat for us. And we're starting to see a little bit of movement in the UK. So Mel Stride is now starting to answer to letters. Clearly Mel Stride understands nothing about the issues, but at least the British are starting to understand there is a problem with FATCA and that there are British accidentals and that something needs to be done. And that's really reassuring to us, I suppose. And then there's this mission that the French government is going on to DC. What we think is happening or not the European Data Privacy Board not having an official position on FATCA for us implicitly confirms the findings of Professor Garbarino that there's a big issue. EU governments refusing to grant foreign freedom of information requests on FATCA data flows implies EU governments know that FATCA is not reciprocal and that there's this massive transfer of data from Europe to the US, but with absolutely nothing coming back. Why? Are they worried about this, about the money that's being wasted on FATCA by banks and on CRS and the paucity of information that's coming from the US and the knock-on effects it could have on CRS? It's conjecture on my part, but you can guess what I think. The EU wanted FATCA so they could push CRS through. And I wonder, this is the point, why there's this kind of willful blindness to FATCA and the issues that FATCA is creating. Is it just because the European Union wants CRS so badly that they're fighting for FATCA at all costs, overlooking the incredible cost that this is generating for the kind of the financial services globally? Now, I know banks are not flavor of the month, but for me, I think it's very interesting to note that the big four, the accountancy firms, PwC, KPMG, they stopped disclosing FATCA and CRS compliance costs in about 2013. Why? Because they are making billions of dollars every year to create programs for these financial institutions for mechanics that just are not working. So it's just a massive waste, which is penalising European citizens, quite frankly. And so we understand the EU Commission and the European governments wants and support CRS, and we do too as individuals. We're not international tax cheats. But is the best way to protect CRS precisely not to distinguish it from FATCA and help us push back on FATCA's excesses, all the accidental American issues? You take all of this noise away from FATCA and AEOI, and then all of a sudden there's a much healthier discussion on CRS. Just very quickly, because I'm probably overrunning my time.
Sorry.
Yes. I've got one last point to make.
2 minutes.
Yeah, 2 minutes. I don't even need that. I mean, basically, we've spoken to lots of people. Everybody knows of accidentals now. There was a summit in Washington, D.C. between a European delegation and the U.S. a couple of weeks ago. We had people representing us there. Everybody, whether it's from the European side or the American side, knows about us, but nobody wants to do anything. And what the Americans are basically saying is, until Europe starts defending its citizens, we're not going to do anything because we have no vested interest. You guys are not voters. You're not fully fledged American citizens, which is completely true. I mean, I'm not an American citizen. I would never dream of voting in an American election. So the Americans are saying, come get us, kind of thing. And that's what I find kind of interesting, which is the European stance, which seems to be a little bit right now. We're washing our hands of the issue. We're hiding behind excuses. IGAs were negotiated nationally, yada, 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 to basically just not confront the issue. And I'd almost like to finish with this rhetorical question, which is the following. So to address that point about the stance of the European Union, if you had a child and that child had two parents, one of those two parents was abusing the child, what should the other parent do? Should the other parent sit around and do nothing on the basis that it's within the rights and the prerogatives of the abusive parent to abuse the child because that's part of their parental authority? Or should the other parent do something for their child? And I'll just finish with that question, because that's exactly what we're facing right now. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Ďakujem pekne. Teraz poprosím pana Thomasa Neela.
Thank you very much. Mr. Thomas Neal from the European Commission, please. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Now, this petition and our response, as the petitioner has explained, it concerns three issues. It concerns the privacy rights issues, the data protection issues, that is. It concerns the potential discrimination in European financial services, access under the Payments Account Directive, and overall FATCA itself, where it has some tax implications, in particular because of the definition that the US uses concerning who it taxes. Now, the Commission has responded formally on this. Because of these three issues, it in fact covers three departments at the Commission. I will talk on the taxation side, and if you permit me, I will ask my colleagues to come back on the data protection and on the application of the Payments Account Directive after me. So broadly speaking, from a taxation front, what we see is we have 28 intergovernmental agreements, FATCA agreements. 28 member states have agreed with the US to exchange information. Now, the information they're providing is in fact very similar to that which other countries across the world have agreed to exchange under the Common Reporting System. And of course, within the EU, we have this system under our Directive on Administrative Cooperation. So the information that is travelling backwards and forwards is very much the same. Of course, there is one issue that, in fact, we believe that there is less reciprocity. The US does not appear to provide quite as much information to EU member states. However, there's no certainty from the Commission's side. We don't have access to this. These are national agreements. These are agreements that our member states have agreed. Now, in our response to the Parliament's wish that we should review FATCA, we responded and said we will do what we can with the information we have. We are prepared to discuss with the Council, and if the Council and the Member States wish to give us a mandate, we will accept a mandate to discuss with the US how FATCA can be implemented in a more acceptable manner, how this exchange of information can require, if you like, less inconvenience to the dual citizens. Because, of course, this is about dual citizens. The issue about FATCA is that the US defines its taxable people as citizens. The rest of the world does it on the basis of residents. But, of course, this has been internationally accepted for many, many years. All our member states in their double tax agreements with the US accept that the US have the right to have this definition of tax residence. Now, so what we have said is we will do what we can, but one thing I can add to the written information is that our Commissioner, Commissioner Moscovici, he has discussed with the Secretary of State Mnuchin this issue of FATCA, and the area that was discussed was how to make it easier for these dual citizens to comply with their tax responsibilities. And there appears to be some possibilities of developments there, but this is still at an informal stage. As regards to other possibilities, one of making it easier to renounce their citizenship, that has not been raised yet. Neither has the possibility of us trying to persuade the US to drop this approach to citizens-based taxation. And that's on the taxation side. If you'll permit me, I would ask my colleagues to say a few words on the Payments Accounts Directive and on the data protection issue.
Good morning.
Pan Brignoni.
Nicola Brignoli, representing the
Welcome.
Department of the Commission for Financial Services, speaking in particular with regard to the Payment Accounts Directive. To echo what our colleagues from DG Taxud has said and has stated in the January 2018 update to this committee, the Commission has liaised with the financial industry to gather more information on how many residents in the EU might have difficulties obtaining financial services because they present FATCA indications. And the financial industry has flagged more than once that the granting of the tax identification number for FATCA reporting was a source of concern for the industry. In March 2018, the Commission requested the European Banking Authority to consult national supervisors on these issues to assess how many consumers in how many countries have not been able to open or keep a payment account because of FATCA, and it emerged among European Banking Authority's members that only one national authority had in fact received formal complaints related to FATCA. The Commission also raised this issue with the Government Expert Group on Retail Financial Services in April 2018, finding similar feedback from the Member State. Now, under the Payment Accounts Directive, all consumers who are legally resident in the European Union, including accidental Americans and let's say real Americans, are entitled to open a basic payment account irrespective of their nationality or member state of residence. Member states are responsible for enforcing national legislation transposing the directive, including this particular right. Further to the resolution approved by the European Parliament last summer, the Commission has performed the analysis of the transposition of the relevant articles of the Payment Accounts Directive, namely Article 15 on non-discrimination and Article 16 on right of access to a payment account with basic features in all the 28 member states, but was not able to identify any specific transposition issue which would be relevant in the context of this petition and provide for a discriminatory basis towards accidental Americans.
Ďakujem pekne. A teraz ešte pani Alica Vekeman.
Thank you very much indeed. Mrs. Alicia Veckerman from DG Justice, please.
Data protection, I would like to clarify some of the points that we just heard in the presentation and also some that were addressed in the report from Professor Gabarino, which was presented here last year. In particular, that report suggested that GDPR obligations no longer apply because of the intergovernmental agreements and that individuals would have no longer possibilities to obtain redress under the GDPR. First, the intergovernmental agreements do not pose an obstacle to comply with EU data protection law. In fact, the agreements themselves, they refer to other tax treaties signed by the EU, member states, and the US, in particular the Council of Europe or OECD Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters. And this convention explicitly stipulates that nothing in the convention affects the rights and safeguards that exist in national legislation. So both member state authorities and financial institutions remain fully subject to all of their obligations under the GDPR. This includes transparency obligations and, for example, obligations to respond to requests from data subjects. We also understand that national laws implementing the intergovernmental agreements have specific obligations in the area of data protection for financial institutions and national authorities. In addition to this, all redress mechanisms that are provided by the GDPR are available. So any individual in the EU can address a complaint with respect to data protection in the context of FATCA to his or her national data protection authority and has access to judicial redress in the national courts. So the lawfulness of the transfers of personal data in the context of FATCA should really require an in concreto assessment. And in this respect, I would like to recall that the data protection authorities of the member states are the enforcers of EU data protection rules. They are independent national authorities and they are therefore best placed to assess the situation. The DPAs, so in the European Data Protection Board, which brings all of those together, they have expressed a position on FATCA in the past. In February last year, they adopted a public statement in which they came to the conclusion that there had been no occasions where the transfers under the FATCA regime had to be prohibited. And in the meantime, we have been informed that following exchanges with the collective of European Accidental Americans, the European Data Protection Board is looking into this issue more closely to further clarify the situation in the member states. The Commission is a member of the European Data Protection Board, and we are following any developments on this topic closely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now this is time for my distinguished colleagues, members of European Parliament. Madam Sophie in 't Veld, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It is quite frustrating to be here again, talking about this yet again. And I apologize in advance to the people of the Commission because whatever I'm going to say doesn't concern you personally. I make a distinction between the Commission as the political body, which is responsible, or should be responsible, and the people like you just doing your job. But quite honestly, it is painfully obvious that the Commission, the political body, chooses not to tackle this topic. Why? Because in so many areas, the Commission behaves like the poodle of the United States. If any other country does this, if any other country would harass citizens with EU citizens with double nationality this way, then immediately, you know, there would be a statement by Juncker or Mogherini or whatever. Here they go, oh, it's not our competence. Look, this argument is being used, you know, in a very opportunistic way. Did the European Commission have competence, for example, to conclude the Turkey statement? No, it did not. But it didn't prevent the Commission from doing that, and it served as a basis for sending 6 billion euro to Turkey. So why is the European Commission not taking its responsibility? Sorry, but to hear, you know, how you tackle this like a kind of box-ticking exercise, saying, oh, well, you know, we've checked the implementation of the payment account directive, and there are no mistakes. Oh, we've not been able to establish that there are any problems. Come on. Come on, they're real people, you know, who have hands and feet. You can touch them. They exist. And they're... Exactly. Of course, there are plenty of data. There are plenty of people. They write to us. You know, we know that they exist. So how can you just close your eyes to the fact that they exist? And it's amazing. People, this really has everything to do with the attitude of the United States. You may have read in the media that just before Christmas, without even informing the European Union, the US decided to downgrade the diplomatic status of the EU. That is how they treat us. Okay? So you should be standing up for the rights of EU citizens. You know, EU citizenship is supposed to mean something. So, and I think that basically the accidental Americans are just the victim. You're just caught in, you know, a whole bunch of other fights that are about tariffs on cars and all the other things that you mentioned, where we don't want to be, you know, to piss off the Americans, and therefore they consider, okay, how many people does this concern? Is it electorally significant? No, okay, we're not going to touch it. Now, what can we still do? First of all, maybe we should organize a session inviting Moscovici and maybe politicians from at least the countries where something is happening, France, the Netherlands, Germany, maybe the UK, and have a round table here before the elections, because I think sadly, you know, for months over summer, nothing is going to move because everybody is waiting for the new parliament and the new commission. So if we could have a roundtable event before the elections with all those people and trying to get to some sort of joint strategy, and also, you know, putting some responsibility on the shoulders of the European Commission. And then secondly, I think the Commission, maybe, you know, the Petty Committee can ask officially to the European Commission to have a kind of a reference desk where people who, you know, FATCA victims can report directly. So the Commission can then no longer claim that they don't know of anyone who's in difficulty. I think they should appoint someone. I'm sure they have one civil servant somewhere who would have time on his or her hands to process the complaints of FATCA victims, so that at least we get an idea of the scale of the problem. Those two suggestions I would like to put to this committee.
Merci.
Thank you. Well, I entirely agree with what Sophie said. Unfortunately, this isn't the first time, but how many times, not just on this subject, but others, we have European citizens who come and explain to us their rights that we're supposed to defend, and explain that their rights are being trampled on, and the only response we get is, well, we can't do this, it's not our competence. We looked, there's no problem. I don't know. I mean, once again, it's not the people here representing the Commission that are at fault. The institution obliges them to be the spokesperson of this violence. I mean, we don't really realize the violence this represents. The only response we give to the citizens is that you don't exist and your rights don't exist. And it's not up to us. And then we get lost in major discussions wondering why people don't trust the European Union institutions. Why do they doubt the relevance of the European project? Why don't they like the institutions? Why do we have so much difficulty trying to convince them of our usefulness? Well, to be quite honest, I'm sorry to say this, but it's really difficult afterwards to explain our legitimacy, our role, our usefulness. Quite frankly, when we're there with this kind of response, I don't know if you really have an idea of the violence that this represents. People who turn to us asking, telling us, you are representing us. The executive institutions are supposed to defend our rights, and the only response you have is, we can't do anything. And in fact, we're not even sure there's really a problem. I don't know. I really can't get my head around it. It's really detestable. And I really can't get over this sort of response. I mean, Sophie's right.
maybe the way of doing this is set up a direct confrontation between the Commission and the citizens. I mean, maybe by meeting, then the real problem will appear to the people that are supposed to take this on board. I mean, everyone's just passing the buck to say, well, it's not my fault, it's not my responsibility, it's the others. I think you're right if I turn to the petitioner. I mean, we see that when there are economic interests at stake which are rather more substantial, well, all of a sudden the ability to move or do something seems to be a bit greater. We can go up the chain of responsibility. We can complain about human rights. But maybe if we get the banks involved, that might get things moving. I mean, there's quite an urgency, in fact. The end of the moratorium will make things shift somewhat. Because as of the end of this year, the moratorium exempting banks from transmitting social security numbers of people subject to FATCA will fall. So that's an additional element to call this into question, but that's going to be added to the data protection issue, which I think already gives us enough to be getting on with, so go for it. It's too bad we're end up with this, but I think that might be the only way of getting anywhere. In any case, we, Sophie and all of the colleagues here, the only power we have at the moment is to be the spokesperson of those people who are discriminated against and who are having their rights denied. I know there's an internal discussion. Well, okay, we discussed it. We'll move on to something. No, you can't just close off subjects like this. It's a continuous problem for the people who are affected. And we need to keep this subject alive, and it's disappointing for us as well. But I mean, we have to continue to be the spokesperson for these European citizens, because that is our role as a representative of the European citizens. We have to continue to defend them.
Thanks
Thank you very much, Mrs. Cat-Darling.
Well, I agree with a lot which has been said. I guess the thing which I feel the most is that it's really understandable why people are so angry and so frustrated, why accidental Americans across Europe are so angry and so frustrated by the inaction of those authorities who are meant to be defending their rights, whether it's at national level or at European level. And I think we as the European Parliament should also be quite affronted as an institution, again, not towards you individually, but towards the Commission, because the European Parliament resolution in July made very, very clear demands about what we would like to see as a European response, including a coordinated approach, a clear strategy, setting out clear actions. And as far as I can tell from the responses, and the coordination here is that we have three parts of the Commission sitting in the same room, replying for their specific competences. But beyond that, I don't see a coordinated European strategy on FATCA and on the implications, particularly for accidental Americans. And I think that's an affront also to the European Parliament when a resolution is adopted with what is, in effect, an enormous majority, particularly in the context of the political dynamics of this European Parliament. That is an enormous majority. For that to effectively be ignored, I think, should be raised as an issue from the Parliament itself to the Commission. I can only assume then, and agree with Sophie, that this is primarily a question of political will. And I was born in Tanzania. I arrived in the UK when I was 11 months. I can only imagine what would happen if the Tanzanian government started to ask for tax on my salary, what the reaction would be. And yet, Americans who were born in the US, accidental Americans, I should say, who are born in the US, to European parents came back when they were 11 months and now subjected to this draconian system. So I think that question of political will is really at the heart of this. And I think our role as the European Parliament is basically to stand with accidental Americans and not to let this be brushed to one side, brushed under the carpet, and also left in a limbo through this whole period which will be coming of the European elections, new commission, and the inevitable kind of, not paralysis, but the inevitable horse trading that happens after European elections. So I completely agree with Sophie's proposals that we should do something as urgent as we can before the elections. And that's all the more important for British accidental Americans, because I think the petitioner was very charitable to the UK in the presentation. I think it's been absolutely deplorable how long this has just been completely ignored in Westminster. Letters have been ignored. I personally have raised it with the front bench of my party. I don't feel that it's been taken seriously by either front benches in Westminster. We have some really great MPs who are fighting and raising it on behalf of constituents, including the Labour MP for Birmingham, Preet Kaur Gill. But they're a small group, and it's only as a result of their persistence that Mel Strider started replying as the minister responsible. So the concern that I have is in the context of Brexit for British accidental Americans, once we're out of the door and once we're on the high seas of global politics, and we know the British government are desperate to avoid offending the US government and are desperate to do anything to get a UK-US trade deal. My concern is the situation for British accidental Americans will become far more difficult, which I just feel I have a moral responsibility to try and ensure that we maintain that solidarity, which accidental Americans amongst themselves across Europe have with each other, regardless of which country they're living in or from. But I would plead, I can well imagine that there's a logistical nightmare and a practical nightmare of organising anything in the Parliament from now until the elections. But I would plead that we be a bit innovative and imaginative about how we could organise something as quickly as possible to avoid that this continues on further, and to really try as the Parliament to hold the Commission to account for the resolution that we adopted in July. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ďakujem pekne. Zdá sa, že už...
Thank you very much indeed. So, everybody's been able to take the floor. I'd like to thank you for this exchange of views. We've had the initial reactions of the Commission. We've had them in writing. And we've also heard the point of view of the LIBE and Econ committees. So we've had quite a comprehensive discussion on this here in the Parliament. And now I'd like to say that there's been a lot of criticism raised here vis-à-vis the European Commission. And I agree with some of the points, but we can't really direct that criticism of the people from the Commission here. That must be directed at the political level. It's a political issue, this, and the Commission will have to take the decisions at the very highest political level. So with this, I would suggest that, well, this is still open, this petition. Secondly, last time we discussed this issue, and I suggest the same as last time, we write a letter, a very clear letter to the US Congress to make them aware of this issue. Thirdly, we should be sending a letter to Commissioner Moscovici, maybe copying in Mr. Juncker, and we will ask you to come up with a timetable. Commission representatives, all three of you, have said there is possibility for this, but we do need a political decision at the highest level. But we'll need a timeline from the European Commission. Fourth point. Member states, we should involve them. I agree with this proposal. We shall send a letter to the presidency of the Council, and we'll ask member states to assess the situation and give their position as to how they think we should move forward. Is that enough? Are these 4 points, are they okay? Good, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.